If I did a show, it could be just in front of old Hessian bags and people would watch it. Unless, of course, this is being popped in a time capsule along with a lot of my other contributions to the communications industry. It's really a monologue interrupted by a total stranger.
I think there's something very absurd in me sitting up here in a three-piece suit with a tie belonging to the 11th Irish Hussars Regiment, which I was never in.
I forgot to curtsy. I should.
Oh, my darling, thank you.
One of the reasons I adore me is that I keep a secret. I don't divulge. So this must go no further. Destroy you. What sort of a monster do you think I am?
I know you're not a monster, but everyone always picks on my divorces and my marriages.
I'm not. I may touch upon you. And this is the only difference between me and you. One of them. My husband is a registered charity child.
But to work directly with an audience is, to me, the greatest pleasure of all.
It's been a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, darling.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for the second episode of our Ghosts of Oz series. In this episode, we take a look at those falling stones of south-western Australia, the Mayanup Poltergeist, or the Jannick.
The crack hours huddled in terror inside. Hundreds of stones must have fallen that night. During the winter months of 1955, visitors and locals flocked to the farming properties of brothers Bill and Doug Hack of Mayanup, Western Australia, some 280 kilometres south of the capital Perth. On show there, mostly in the dark hours before midnight, was an ongoing unusual example of the paranormal. A noisy ghost that terrified inhabitants by pelting warm stones of varying sizes at the homes of two-part Aboriginal farm worker families a mile apart. Over the next 2 years, it would baffle and fascinate thousands of people from all walks of life. Many would visit the Shire of Boyup Brook and experience the phenomenon firsthand, while thousands of others would read about the phenomenon in newspapers, books or magazines. On the evening of May 17, the Mayanup stones had begun to fall. The Nyanga Aboriginal family of Gilbert and Jean Smith were living on Bill and Ethel Hack's sheep and flax growing property, Kennenup, with 5 of their 6 children in a dwelling about 500 metres from the main homestead. Jean was pregnant with her 7th child. At that time, the strange events began. At dusk one night, Jean Smith, returning with an armful of wood for the fire, heard a plop as if a stone had forcibly struck the outside wall. Her husband Gilbert and several of their children heard the noise too. They looked at each other, surprised. Gilbert went outside, walked around their home, seeking the source of the incident. He found nothing unusual and returned to the kitchen table. Next, an old golf ball flew across the room, striking the wall, and they also heard the sound of a stone landing on the roof. A quick discussion followed. The couple felt under attack. Was someone trying to scare them? If so, they were succeeding. Gilbert decided they needed immediate help and drove down to the Hack's homestead. Ethel Hack was in bed, and Bill was away at a meeting. Ethel heard Gilbert yelling to wake up her son Murray, who was asleep on the veranda. Ethel went outside and confronted Gilbert, assuming he was drunk because he was rambling about being attacked by mysterious stone throwers. She suggested he go home, get some sleep, so she and her family could do the same. Rebuffed by Ethel's dismissal, Gilbert drove his ute to his known friends, the Crackeras, who lived only 3 minutes away, directly opposite the Kennenup farm entrance. Molly Krakauer and her husband Alf readily agreed to bundle their 7 children up in blankets and spend the rest of the night with Gilbert and Jean. It was a restless night for both families. Stones continued to fall on the roof and strike the outside walls. The ongoing noise made sleep virtually impossible. One peculiar incident happened inside the home too. As Molly lay on the floor, 5 large slices of apparently freshly cut potato fell on her chest. Freshly cut potato? Further weirdnesses followed later. Just after dawn, the 4 parents made a thorough search around the Smith camp. There were no tracks, no footprints. Everything appeared untouched. No sign of intruders. No ready explanations available. Just dozens of stones on their roof. That day, Wednesday, 18 May, the Smiths discussed their situation with their boss, Bill Hack. They suggested there had to be a madman or evil spirit around causing these weird nighttime shenanigans. Nonsense, replied Bill. You reckon some rival Aboriginals were causing the strife. If it starts up again, we'll get to the bottom of it. During their conversation, Bill Hack heard a word he'd never heard before. Jannick. It was one he'd hear time and time again during the Mayanup stones phenomena. It is an Aboriginal word referring to a person's spirit. Bill decided to drive up to the Smith place that night to check it out for himself. Took his younger brother Ron with him. Bill drove right around the Smith camp with his car headlights on high beam to see if he could catch any culprits in its beam. He saw nothing unusual. As he came to the stop near the front door, he heard a stone rattle on his car roof and reckoned there had to be a practical joker close by. The brothers went inside and sat in front of the open fire with Jean. Ron Hack recalled how he felt his hair stand on end as he witnessed the unexplainable. He was amazed to see a small stone fly towards him from the rear of the fire, hurtle past his chair and roll along the floor almost simultaneously. Then a lump of charcoal appeared to fall from the ceiling onto the middle of the table. Ron then heard a rattling sound coming from under the table. He investigated and found a warm stone in an enamelled dish. The Hack brothers were completely at a loss to explain the seemingly unnatural movements of the stones. Bill Hack discussed his reactions with another brother, Doug, who farmed Linford Hill on the opposite side of Boyart Brook, Kojonup Road. The 3 brothers, Bill, Doug and Ron, decided to revisit the Smith camp that evening so Doug could experience the phenomena for himself. Once they arrived, Doug didn't have to wait long. As he entered the Smith's living area, Doug Hack heard a small stone land on the floor behind him. He quickly retraced his steps out the back door, hoping to catch any lurking culprit, but there was no one there. Surprised, he went back inside, picked up the stone. It was about the size of a walnut and quite warm. Doug shook his head, bewildered. Bill Hack noticed that his 3 kangaroo dogs and a sheepdog, usually growling and barking at the least sound on the property, remained aloof to the rocks, landing on the roof inside the house. When Bill told other local farmers about these incidents, they were sceptical. One even suggested it could have been a possum nesting in a nearby tree that threw the stones. Bill quickly put paid to that. The nearest trees were 20 metres away, too far for a possum to throw anything. It must be vandals, one group of farmers decided. As well as being blood warm, the stones had other unexpected characteristics. When they landed on the roof, a table, the floor, or just on the ground, they never rolled with momentum. They just sit there. Further, although it might be wet outside, the stones that landed inside the house were always dry. So a few nights later, more than 20 farmers surrounded the Smith hut, armed with shotguns, rifles, spotlights, and lamps to lay the ghost low. Just before midnight, the stones started to rain down, inside and outside the hut. The farmers shone their lights into the bush about 200 yards from the hut. They blazed away with their shotguns and rifles, but the stones continued to fall. They turned the spotlights and rifles up into the trees about 100 yards from the camp. Still the stones fell. The farmers were shaken by the eerie experience. The stones fell or appeared intermittently until about 4 a.m. None of them fell with much force, rather they dropped, as if from a height of about 1 foot. And how could a practical joker stand in the bush 200 yards away, land stones inside the Smith camp? Popular storekeeper, the late Fred Proctor, who had shops in Boyup Brook and Mayanup, visited the Smith camp, having decided to put an end to the stones business because discussion of it frightened some of his lady customers. Fred and 3 friends joined a large crowd, including a few newspapermen, around a roaring campfire. Lots of stones fell during their visit, both outside and inside the dwelling, for which they were unable to provide any realistic explanations. Fred's final opinion, reached around midnight, was that the phenomena was supernatural and he had no hope of stopping it. The very first newspaper to publish an article on the Mayanup stones was the Blackwood Times of Bunbury, WA. Over a 12-month period, the Blackwood Times published many news stories from Mayanup and interviewed many witnesses. Their first article, 3rd June 1955, was a front-page interview with Bill Hack, in which he put forward his view that the flying stones were not the result of human activity, but were of supernatural origin and defied simple explanation. Obviously, Bill had changed his initial idea of rival Aboriginals causing strife as the basis of his disruptions. Final paragraph of this item read: "There have been no incidents during the past week, and the farmer and everyone concerned is hoping that the poltergeist or spirit has decided that he, she, or it has had enough fun for the time being." The flying stones returned almost immediately, as reported in the following week's paper. A further week later, the Blackwood Times carried an interview with Ron and Marjorie Hack of Linford Hill, who told of mysterious lights accompanying some of the stones. Strangely enough, it was a disbeliever in ghosts, Mrs. Bill Hack, Ethel, who had seen them. The sceptical Mrs. Hack had decided to wait by a wire fence that runs down a gully about 200 yards from the hut. She thought she might hear the twang of the wires as an intruder climbed through. It was about dusk when Mrs. Hack saw the light, a small round one suspended in mid-air about 5 feet from the ground. It moved very quickly and very smoothly down the gully, where it disappeared. Mrs. Hack told us, "There is no road or track where I saw it, eliminating car headlights or their reflections." Much the same time as the mysterious light was seen by Ethel Hack, her husband called into Gilbert and Jean's place to warn them not to shoot at any figure they saw down near the fence, because it would be his wife. While Bill was with the Smiths, 3 stones landed on the roof and 1 outside. This would be about the same time as the light appeared. The next development also reported that the Blackwood Times was that the stones had become raining on Alf and Molly Krakauer's camp on Linford Hill, in addition to the Smiths' dwelling in Mayanup. The Krakauers were also frightened when the phenomena first began, and the white men on the properties were kept busy standing guard with a gun each night. Neighbours now descended on both the Smiths and Krakauers camps. The gatherings at both camps became quite social occasions at a time when many farms were still quite isolated. Many evenings would see a large crowd of visitors gathered around the campfire drinking beer or tea. As many seats as possible were provided around the blazing fire. Occasionally a stone would land so gently in a glass of beer that the glass would not break and not a drop would be spilt. Groups of men stood around, periodically removing small stones from the rims of their hats. At the Krakauers, according to Hugh Schmidt in Australasia Post, at first the stones started on their camp lightly, but after a week they reached a crescendo and literally rained down. One evening they started falling at dark and kept falling until 4 a.m. following morning. Krakauers huddled in terror inside. Hundreds of stones must have fallen that night. Meanwhile they continued to fall on the Smith camp. The remarkable part of the eerie business was that on the Smith property the stones seemed to be centred around Gene Smith. On the Krakauer property they were centred on 14-year-old Audrey Krakauer, the attractive eldest child of the Krakauers. To establish whether part of this theory was correct, some reputable citizens took Audrey away from her home. The stones continued to fall around her, some as big as walnuts. Next, a group of 6 psychic researchers visited Mayanup from Perth. 3 of them sat up overnight with the Smiths, and other 3 at the Krakauers. They witnessed stones falling and heard unusual noises, but couldn't provide any explanations, and left. They returned again within a couple of weeks, experienced similar poltergeist activity, and also reported seeing floating lights. Their final report stated, no living person was responsible, but the activity was similar to poltergeist activity reported from other parts of the world. Earlier, Gilbert Smith had spoken to Bill Hack about bringing an Aboriginal medicine man, or Marbar, to Mayanup to help stop the phenomenon. Bill was surprised Gilbert held such strong cultural ties with his heritage, but readily agreed. Old Sammy Miller, who was gifted with the sight, came from Mount Barker with a young carer and stayed with the Smiths for a few days. Sammy announced that Jannick was the cause of the problems. All poltergeist activity ceased during his visit and resumed when he left. On returning to Mount Barker, Sammy apparently consulted the 2 other living Marbars in the Great Southern area, and they concluded that the Jannick was the spirit of Gene Smith's father, Alf Eads, who was living in the Kojanup area but seriously ill. Alf Eads had suffered a stroke while building a fence on Bill Hack's Kennenup property before the stones began falling. His granddaughter had found him slumped against a gate and with help from her father Gilbert rushed him to the Kojanup hospital. Later discharged, Mr. Eads was living with relatives and disabled by the stroke. The witch doctors believed that because Gene was Alf Eads' favourite child, his spirit was leaving his body, travelling all the way from Kojanup, 60 kilometres away, to the Smiths camp at Kennenup to be with her. The witch doctors said that Alf Eads' spirit needed to be put back into his body and agreed to do so. The ghost laying ceremony at Kojanup, held on July 5, 1955, attracted a large respectful crowd. Bill and Doug Hack accepted the invitation to attend, as well as most members of Mr. Eads' extended family. There was a large group of interested bystanders gathered at Gilbert and Jean Smith's place on Mayanup for the duration of the distant ceremony too. The ceremony took place in the evening gloom around the humpy, in which the ailing Alphides lay sleeping most of the time. He did rouse himself once though, to declare emphatically, "My spirit never left me. Go away, you bloody witch doctors." The old man, it seemed, had been brought up in the white man's ways. He lacked a traditional Nyingar upbringing. The notion of witch doctors was foreign to him, but the ceremony went ahead despite his feeble protest. The witch doctors had apparently worked out a plan of action. Sammy Miller, all sanguine and businesslike, took up station at the head of Alphide's bed and faced in the direction of Mayanup. Freddie Winmar took a blanket down into a hollow behind Alphide's camp. He went alone, but in the light of the full moon he could be seen crouching over the blanket. The natives watched, spellbound, as Freddie rose shakily from the ground holding the blanket as if he had something under it. Muttering in hoarse, guttural tones, he carefully carried burden up the hill towards the Heshman camp. Inside the camp he drew the blankets from Alphide's body, took the spirit from under the blanket and put it back into his body, ostensibly reintroduced the wandering spirit into the native's body. Alphides is reported to have said, "It felt just like a big gust of wind hitting me in the chest." Would this be the end of the stone throwing? No, far from it. Those waiting at Mayanup for the visiting party to return home from the ceremony heard 2 stones land on Smith's roof. As the Smith family drove up the driveway, they were showered in stones as well. 6 weeks after the ceremony, Alfie died. The stones continued falling during the next 10 weeks and gradually weakened. On 20 September 1955, only 2 stones fell during daylight, and it was quiet for months. In April 1956, almost a year since it first began, it started all over again, with bigger stones, bottles, boots and bones. On 20 August 1956, there was a truly spectacular poltergeist session, which Bill Hack recorded in his diary. 5:30 p.m. I fluked a most extraordinary session. It was broad daylight, a brick on the roof, brass tap from Kero drum hit wall from southwest. Tried to calculate velocity by throwing it back at the wall. Each time I threw, I was hit in back by a 1 or 2 pound stone. I challenged the thrower to continue. Every time, 25 times, he responded. Then he dropped a cake of soap in front of us. Then a child's shoe hit me. Another cake of soap hit wall. It was replaced on table. It immediately hit one of us in the back. It was replaced, and so on. Then followed forks, spoons, a file, onion, knife, socks, ball of silver paper and potatoes. The kitchen utensils, soap, didn't travel more than 8 to 15 feet. The original brass tap I left lying on the ground and walked towards the car. The tap hit me on the back. No one was within 10 feet of it. Then a stone weighing 35 pounds, known to have been in the fireplace, fell gently onto the tank. A few months later, the Krakow family decided they'd had enough. They left Doug Hack's employment and moved to the Mount Barker district. About 6 months later, May 26, 1957, Gilbert and Jean Smith made a similar decision. They'd stayed on through the whole ruckus because of their rapport with Bill Hack. Jannick and the constant visitors wore them out. Family camped near the Mayanup racecourse for the first few weeks. The mysterious landing there of a lemonade bottle on their water tank, followed by stones and sticks, was enough to make them move away the following morning. Months later, Gilbert and Jean called in to visit Bill and Ethel Hack, and Bill persuaded them to visit their old dwelling. As they drove up to it and opened the car door, one stone landed on the roof, followed by a shower of small stones. Then came more showers of stones, one bottle, one milk tin, one piece of bone, a stick. The Smith called in again, August 10, went up to the abandoned camp, and in a few minutes, one bottle, various stones, an empty matchbox, cigarette butt were collected as they fell to the ground, some inside the house and some out. The Smiths moved into their own home on Boyup Brook in 1964, and Gilbert died the following year, a relatively young man. Their former home on the hill at Mayanup, where it all started, collapsed after 20 years of being vacant and was subsequently demolished. Jean Smith was asked if she still had the Jannick calling at her home on the outskirts of Boyup Brook all these years later. Yes, she replied, I just don't tell anyone anymore.
Wow, this was a really strange tale. And almost with a bit of sadness as we find that it kind of pestered the residents in the end. I find it very interesting that the first people that lived in the area believed that it was the spirit of Jean's father, Alf. It must have been quite hard for them to live day in, day out with this occurring. And it's driven them obviously from their homes, most of them. It is quite sad. And also that it persisted even after they'd moved to another location. It seems to have followed them. This strange phenomenon or poltergeist activity wasn't just isolated to the Mayanup area. It was also located at different places around the Perth, Bunbury, and also Albany areas of WA. Areas such as Pumphrey's Bridge, Boddington, Borden, and the Mayanup area, which is quite strange. It all seems to occur away from the coast, although some people on various Facebook pages have stated that even living in Perth, they would get the odd stone collection hitting their roof. And it wasn't hailing and it wasn't raining outside, and it usually was during the winter months. One of the members of the Hack family have written a book about the encounter. The stories have been published widely, as well as in the communities themselves. It's still talked about, and many remember the time when this all happened, and it happened in the 60s and 70s as well, it is believed. It very well might be a place that we need to go and investigate. Until we get over to WA, we hope you enjoyed this episode about the spirit stones, or the Mayanup poltergeist, or the Jannick. Whatever the legend, it was pretty scary. So don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any more of our ghost stories.
As a crime reporter, I considered fairly cynical and hard-headed, and I thought the whole job was a hoax until I got down there. Apparently, these stones had been doing this for over a period of about 5 days when I arrived. Not only was I quite convinced that they were in some peculiar way dropping out of the sky, but a tent in which the Aborigines had been living, they had said that stones had actually dropped inside the tent. So one night two of Donaldson's adult boys and another white man sat in the tent with the Aborigines, and while they were in there, stones actually dropped inside the tent and plopped onto the blankets. They carefully examined the whole of the canvas of the tent, the roof and the sides. There's absolutely no signs at all of any holes. Further to that, a police inspector called Slom Sunter, who'd had very wide country experience, knew the bush, knew the Aborigines, and was a straight down the middle, hard-nosed cop. He was sent down there to investigate, and he put in a report saying that he could find no explanation for it, but that in fact he was convinced it did actually occur. I was so convinced that it had actually occurred that a couple of days later I wrote a story for the Daily News saying that I was convinced of this, although I knew I would be up for ridicule, particularly by a lot of my CIB mates. But I was prepared to do that because I was quite convinced it had happened. How it happened, I don't know. I didn't know at the time, and I've never yet heard an explanation of how or why it happened.
Wouldn't it be nice to go back in time to see it was all bush?
But I was about 27, I think, or 26 at the time this happened. My age now is 72, and I'm still around to tell a bit of the story.
It would bring tears to my eyes and about a big lump in my throat. How could anyone do that?
Now, it happened one night we came home from Pinley on this farm where we camped at the back up here in a little tin uppy, and the stone started falling, which we didn't believe until we saw it. Some big and some small. And they kept going without a stop day and night.
It's a secret rock, very secret ground there, very secret. That place there in the early days, that's where the people had the last spear fight there. Yeah, they're still here, all the ancestors.